I repaired the alien princess's ship. She kissed me and said, "I'll come back for you, human." Jack had long ago accepted that his life peaked at mediocrity, which was fine, really. Mediocrity didn't explode or require diplomatic immunity. The Frontier's Edge trading outpost wasn't much to look at. A collection of prefab structures squatting in rust-colored dust, 3 landing pads that had seen better decades, and exactly 1 bar that served liquor questionable enough to strip paint. Jack's workshop occupied the largest building, though large was relative when your neighbors were storage units and a water reclamation facility that hummed like a dying whale. He'd been elbow deep in a Talaxian freighter's propulsion system when the coffee maker started screaming. Not beeping, screaming. The ancient machine had developed what Jack charitably called personality over the years, which meant it occasionally made sounds that violated several health and safety regulations. He extracted himself from the engine compartment, wiped his hands on a rag that was somehow dirtier than his hands, and shuffled over to silence the mechanical tantrum. Yeah, I hear you," he muttered, jabbing the off button 3 times before it responded. The resulting coffee was thick enough to be considered a war crime. But caffeine was caffeine. He'd learned not to be picky after the incident, with the recycled water tasting like someone's old boot. Turned out someone's old boot had fallen into the filtration system. They never did find the other one. The outpost was quiet today. 2 ships had departed at dawn, a colony vessel headed for the Andorra system, and a passenger liner that had stopped only long enough to dump waste and take on supplies. Jack didn't mind the quiet. Quiet meant he could work without interruptions, without traders arguing about repair costs or pilots insisting they could fix things themselves right before making everything catastrophically worse. He returned to the Talaxian ship, staring at the tangle of conduits and power couplings like they might spontaneously organize themselves into something comprehensible. The owner had described a small rattling sound, which in Jack's experience meant either a loose bolt or imminent apocalypse. There was rarely middle ground. He activated his diagnostic scanner, a bulky handheld unit that predated most governments, and watched the readout scroll past in amber text. "Okay, so you've got a fractured plasma injector, a misaligned graviton regulator, and what I'm pretty sure is a family of flux moths living in your tertiary cooling system," Jack said to the absent ship owner. "The moths I can work with. They're probably the only thing holding this together." He'd just started loosening the injector housing when the sky cracked open. The sound hit first, a thunderous roar that rattled tools off workbenches and set off every proximity alarm on the landing pads. Jack dropped his wrench, which bounced twice and rolled under the freighter, where he'd never find it again, and stumbled outside. His eyes went immediately to the source, a ship trailing smoke and fire, screaming toward the outpost at an angle that physics should have forbidden. "Oh, come on," Jack said to the universe at large. "I just cleaned the pads." The vessel was unlike anything he'd seen in his 15 years at the outpost. Sleek where most ships were utilitarian, graceful where others were geometric blocks of function. Its hull gleamed like polished obsidian, even through the scorch marks and the concerning amount of debris trailing behind it. Whoever designed it had cared about aesthetics, which meant either government work or serious money. Jack was betting on serious money. The ship hit landing pad 2 with enough force to crack the ferrocrete and send up a mushroom cloud of rust-colored dust. Emergency systems screamed to life. Fire suppression drones launched from their housings, medical alerts pinged every registered comm device, and somewhere in the distance, the outpost's ancient warning klaxon began its mournful wail. Jack grabbed a fire extinguisher from the wall mount, realized it was expired by about 6 years, and grabbed it anyway. By the time he reached the pad, the fire drones had done their job, smothering the flames and foam that would take weeks to fully clean up. The ship sat in a crater of its own making, hull breached in 3 places he could see, landing gear crumpled, engines still ticking with residual heat. The main hatch was already opening. Jack expected panic. Injured crew, maybe, or automated distress calls. What he got was a woman who stepped through the smoke like she was entering a ballroom, her posture so perfectly composed that for a moment he forgot about the crash entirely. Her skin was the deep blue of Earth's oceans at midnight, and her ears, long and elegantly pointed, swept back from her face in a way that suggested deliberate evolution, rather than random chance. She wore garments that seemed to shimmer between states, neither quite fabric nor quite energy, and when her eyes found Jack, he felt the assessment down to his bones. Behind her, crew members stumbled out, coughing, dazed but apparently intact. They wore uniforms of that same shimmer state material, though theirs seemed more functional, less regal. Jack looked down at himself. Grease-stained coveralls, boots held together by prayer and adhesive tape, the expired fire extinguisher still clutched in one hand. He looked back up at the woman who was clearly, obviously, catastrophically out of his league in every measurable way. "So," he said, because someone had to say something, and his brain had apparently decided humor was the appropriate response to cosmic scale embarrassment. "I'm guessing you're not here for the continental breakfast?" The woman's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Amusement, maybe, or the brief consideration of whether to have him vaporized. Her crew had fanned out around the crashed ship, assessing damage with handheld devices that made Jack's diagnostic scanner look like a child's toy. One of them, a stocky man with the same midnight blue skin, was arguing quietly into a comm unit while shooting worried glances at the woman. "We require immediate repairs," she said, her voice carrying an accent Jack couldn't place, something that turned certain syllables into music. "Our quantum drive has suffered catastrophic misalignment. The hull integrity is compromised in multiple sections, and our navigation array is broadcasting our position to anyone with functional sensors." Jack nodded slowly, processing the list of problems that range from extremely difficult to maybe impossible with his equipment. He set down the fire extinguisher, which chose that moment to leak foam onto his boot. "Right, so catastrophic misalignment is definitely bad," he said, trying to sound professional, while foam squished between his toes. "And the broadcasting thing, I'm guessing you'd prefer that not happen? Popular lady, lots of unwanted attention, that sort of deal?" The stocky crew member stopped his calm conversation long enough to glare at Jack with an intensity that suggested he knew 17 ways to kill someone with a soup spoon. The woman raised one hand slightly and the glare evaporated. "Something like that," she said. "Can you repair it or not, human?" "Human. Not mechanic or sir or even you there. Just human. Like it was a species designation and possibly a limitation." Jack had been called worse, usually by the same traders who later begged him to fix their ships. "I can take a look," he said, already walking toward the vessel. Up close, the damage was worse than he'd thought. The hull breaches had exposed internal systems that seemed to fold in on themselves in ways that made his eyes water. The metal, if it was metal, had a strange quality, like it existed in more dimensions than he could perceive. "But I'm going to level with you. Your ship is about 40 years more advanced than anything I normally work on. I'm basically a guy with wrenches looking at what might be condensed space-time, or possibly very angry geometry. You have successfully maintained operations at this outpost for 14 years, the woman said. My crew accessed your service records during approach. Your success rate is 97%. The other 3% don't leave reviews, Jack muttered, then caught himself. That was a joke. They all survived. Mostly. There was one incident with a Valorian trader and a plasma coil, but we don't talk about that. He climbed up the crumpled landing struts and peered into the nearest hull breach. Inside, crystalline structures pulsed with faint light, connected by what looked like threads of contained lightning. A control panel had partially melted, its surface displaying symbols that shifted between writing systems he didn't recognize. The quantum drive, he assumed that's what the massive spherical chamber was, sat in the ship's center, surrounded by concentric rings that rotated at different speeds despite having no visible connection to each other. Okay, Jack said, pulling his head back out. Good news is, I think I can work with this. Bad news is, it's going to take all night. I'm going to need to improvise about 60% of the repairs, and there's a non-zero chance I'll accidentally create a small temporal paradox. Acceptable, the woman said immediately. Really, because I was kind of hoping you'd talk me out of the temporal paradox thing. We have no alternatives. The nearest port with adequate facilities is 4 days away at sublight speeds. We do not have 4 days. She turned to her crew, issuing instructions in a language that sounded like wind chimes falling downstairs. They dispersed quickly, The stocky one still shooting, Jack looks that promised future violence. Jack hauled himself fully into the ship, grabbing his toolkit from where he dropped it near the extinguisher. The interior was even more impressive than the exterior. Corridors that seemed to curve in directions that shouldn't exist. Walls that displayed star fields as if the hull were transparent. Floors made of something that felt solid, but looked like frozen water. Everything was scaled slightly larger than human standard, making him feel like he'd wandered into a dollhouse built for very elegant giants. He found the main engineering compartment after only 2 wrong turns, and one brief moment where he was convinced he'd walked in a complete circle despite traveling in a straight line. The quantum drive dominated the space, its rings still rotating, though 2 of them sparked intermittently with energy that made his hair stand on end. "All right," he said, setting down his tools. "Let's see if I can fix Alien Royalty's spaceship with duct tape and misplaced confidence." "I am not royalty," the woman's voice said from directly behind him, nearly sending him into the quantum drive's gravitational field. He spun around. She'd followed him in, moving with such silence that he wondered if she'd simply materialized. She stood in the doorway, backlit by the corridor's ambient glow, watching him with an expression he couldn't read. "You're not, because you've got the whole Regal Bearing thing down, and your crew treats you like you're made of porcelain and commands." Jack pulled out his scanner and started taking readings of the drive assembly. The numbers made no sense, fluctuating between values that his device insisted were impossible. "I am Princess Naomi," she said, as casually as someone might say they were from accounting. "Third daughter of the celestial house of Andreva, heir to the outer territories, and currently very far from where I am supposed to be." Jack's hand slipped and he nearly dropped the scanner into a gap that crackled with what he really hoped wasn't dark matter. He caught it, barely, and turned to stare at her. "So, princess, actual princess. And I made a joke about continental breakfast." He laughed, slightly manic. "Great, cool, that's fine. This is fine. I'm just going to go ahead and fix your impossible space drive now, Your Highness, and we can pretend I'm not having a small crisis about the fact that I'm covered in engine grease and probably smell like burnt plastics." "You do," Naomi said, but her lips quirked slightly at the corners. "Proceed with repairs, Jack." She knew his name. He hadn't told her his name. The ship's computer must have pulled it from the outpost records along with everything else. Wonderful. She probably also knew about the time he'd accidentally ordered 50 crates of Arcturian noodles instead of 5 and had lived off nothing but noodles for 6 months. Jack turned back to the quantum drive, face burning, and started pulling access panels. At least if he created a temporal paradox, there was a chance it would erase this entire conversation from history. The quantum drive's misalignment turned out to be less misalignment and more 3 of the spatial harmonics had decided to occupy the same dimensional frequency and were now engaged in what could only be described as a territorial dispute. Jack had dealt with similar issues in cheaper drives, but those had simple magnetic governors he could adjust. This thing had governors made of something that his scanner identified as crystallized probability, which was either very advanced physics or his scanner had finally given up trying to understand the universe. Naomi hadn't left. She'd settled onto a bench that folded out from the wall, or maybe grew out of it, Jack couldn't tell, and watched him work with unsettling focus. He'd tried making small talk twice, received monosyllabic responses, and decided that princesses apparently didn't do chit-chat while their ships were in pieces. "So the problem," Jack said, mostly to himself, but also because the silence was making him nervous, "is that your drive is trying to exist in multiple quantum states simultaneously, which is normal for quantum drives, except yours is doing it in states that actively hate each other. It's like forcing 3 people who all think they're the captain to share one chair." He reached into the drive assembly with a tool that was technically a plasma calibrator, but that he'd modified to also function as a fork when lunch breaks got desperate. The crystalline structures chimed softly as he adjusted their resonance, the sound climbing and falling, until he found the frequency where they stopped trying to vibrate themselves into another dimension. "Your metaphors are unusual," Naomi said. "Yeah, well, I learned engineering from a Rigelian who explained entropy using a story about his 7 ex-wives, so I'm working with what I've got." Jack checked his scanner readings, swore quietly, and recalibrated the third harmonic ring. How does someone become a princess of outer territories anyway? Do you have to pass a test, or is it more of a birth lottery situation? Birth, Naomi said. Though there are tests, many tests, combat proficiency, diplomatic negotiation, quantum mathematics, stellar cartography, and the traditional art of making one's enemies regret their existence without technically starting a war. Jack glanced back at her. She wasn't smiling, but there was something in her voice that suggested humor, or at least its distant cousin. That last one sounds useful. We just have arm wrestling at the Outpost bar, which is less elegant but more straightforward. He finished with the harmonic rings and moved to the hull breaches, dragging a portable welder that weighed more than most small children. So if you're royalty, what are you doing way out here? This sector isn't exactly on the tourist maps. We're more of a last stop before you give up on civilization kind of place. Naomi was quiet for long enough that Jack thought she might not answer. He started sealing the first breach, the welder throwing blue-white light across the engineering bay. The hull material resisted at first, then seemed to remember it was supposed to be solid and flowed together like mercury. I was avoiding an arranged marriage, she finally said. Jack's hand slipped. The welder carved a line 3 inches longer than he'd intended, and he had to backtrack to fix it. You ran away from an arranged marriage in a ship that probably cost more than this entire outpost? The ship is mine, a gift for my 20th rotation celebration, and I did not run away. I strategically relocated to consider my options. Right, strategically relocated. That's what we call it when people show up here too. Jack moved to the second breach, this one larger and angrier looking, with exposed conduits that sparked whenever he got too close. For what it's worth, arranged marriages sound like a terrible idea. I mean, I've never been married, arranged or otherwise, but forcing two people together because of politics or bloodlines or whatever seems like a good way to make everyone miserable. You understand then? I understand that you crashed a very expensive ship to avoid marrying someone, which suggests either they're really terrible or you're really committed to bad decisions. No offense. Some offense taken, Naomi said, but her tone had warmed slightly. Though you are not entirely wrong, he is the son of the merchant lord of Talaxis, a union that would strengthen trade relations between our houses. He is accomplished, well-educated, and according to every measurement that matters to my family, a suitable match. Jack finished the second breach and started on the third. But he collects preserved insects and once spent 40 minutes explaining the mating habits of the Centaurian sand beetle without noticing I had left the room. Jack laughed, actually laughed, the sound echoing off the curved walls. Okay, yeah, I see the problem. Though in his defense, Centaurian sand beetles have fascinating mating habits. They do this thing where the male builds an elaborate sandcastle and then... He caught himself. I'm not helping, am I? You are not. He sealed the final breach and stood back, surveying his work. The hull looked almost like new, if new meant recently traumatized but holding together through sheer stubbornness. The quantum drive had stopped sparking and settled into a steady hum that his scanner reported as within acceptable parameters, which was the closest thing to a compliment his equipment could give. Navigation array next, Jack said, consulting his mental checklist. That's going to be the tricky part because if I mess it up, you'll either broadcast your position to the entire sector or end up thinking you're in a completely different galaxy. Both have happened. Not to me personally, but I've heard stories. He climbed up to the bridge, which was less a separate room and more an elevated platform surrounded by holographic displays that showed star charts in 3 dimensions. The navigation console had taken damage during the crash, its crystalline interface cracked and flickering. Naomi followed him up, moving with that same impossible grace. Jack pulled up the diagnostic interface, which required him to wave his hands through about 15 layers of holographic menus while trying not to accidentally activate something that would vent the atmosphere or play the royal anthem. He found the navigation subroutines buried under what he assumed were safety protocols, though they might have been recipes. The translation matrix kept glitching. Your people must trust you greatly, Naomi said, watching him work, to operate this facility alone. My people being the Outpost Council, which consists of Martinez, who runs the bar, Chen, who manages the water plant, and a very argumentative maintenance bot named Steve. And they don't trust me so much as tolerate me because I'm the only one who knows which wire does what. Jack bypassed a corrupted data node and rerouted the navigation feed through a backup processor. It's not glamorous, but it's mine, you know? I fix things. People pay me. I don't have to worry about arranged marriages or sand beetles. The navigation array flickered, died completely, then blazed back to life with a chime that sounded vaguely triumphant. The star charts were formed, accurate, and no longer broadcasting their position to every pirate and bounty hunter in range. "There," Jack said, allowing himself a moment of satisfaction. "You're officially invisible again, Your Highness." Naomi stepped closer, studying the displays. Close enough that Jack could smell something like ozone and distant flowers, something that definitely didn't come from his workshop. She reached out and adjusted one of the holographic controls, her long fingers moving with practiced efficiency. "You have done well," she said quietly. "Better than I expected from a human working with unfamiliar technology." "I'll take that as a compliment and ignore the species-based low expectations," Jack said, grinning despite his exhaustion. The twin suns were beginning their rise over the outpost's eastern ridge when Jack finished the final repair, something involving the environmental systems that had been leaking coolant into the life support recyclers. He developed a theory halfway through that the ship was actually semi-sentient and had been passively sabotaging itself out of sympathy for Naomi's situation. But exhaustion was making him philosophical about inanimate objects, which was usually a sign he needed sleep. His hands were steady despite the fatigue, muscle memory guiding the micro-welder through the delicate work of sealing the coolant manifold. The ship's systems had slowly come back online throughout the night, lights brightening, displays activating, even the artificial gravity stabilizing to something that didn't make his inner ear want to file a complaint. Naomi's crew had checked in periodically, offering assistance that mostly involved standing around looking intimidating while Jack explained what he was doing in terms they pretended to understand. "Okay," he said, setting down the welder and stretching until his spine made sounds like bubble wrap. "That should do it. Your ship is now fully functional, only slightly held together by improvisation, and probably won't explode in the next 6 months. I give no guarantees after that." Naomi had remained in the engineering bay for most of the night, leaving only once when her second-in-command, the stocky man who still looked at Jack like he was a problem to be solved violently, had insisted on a private conversation. She'd returned 20 minutes later, her expression unchanged but something tighter around her eyes. Jack hadn't asked. Princesses probably had all kinds of complicated problems that didn't involve coolant leaks. She stood now near the quantum drive, one hand resting on its outer housing, looking at the machinery with something that might have been fondness or might have been relief. The light from the drive cast blue patterns across her face, highlighting the sharp angles of her features and the elegant sweep of her ears. "You work well under pressure," she said. "I work well under caffeine and mounting panic, which I guess looks the same from the outside." Jack started packing up his tools, organizing them by function and how likely they were to disappear into the cosmic void of his workshop. "Your ship's pretty incredible, by the way. I've worked on maybe 300 different vessels over the years, and this one actually made me feel like I understood about 5% of what I was doing. That's high praise in my profession." "The ship was designed by the Royal Engineering Corps," Naomi said. "They incorporated technology from 17 different species, including several that no longer exist. It is meant to be the finest vessel in the fleet." "Well, it's definitely the finest vessel that's ever crashed on my landing pad, so there's that achievement unlocked." Jack hoisted his toolkit, the weight familiar and grounding. "You should be able to reach wherever you're going now. The quantum drive will hold, the navigation won't accidentally send you into a star, and I reinforced the hull breaches with a bonding agent that's technically not rated for spacecraft but works great on Valorian cargo haulers, which are basically the same thing if you squint." Naomi turned to face him fully, and Jack became acutely aware that he looked like he'd been dragged behind a comet. His coveralls had acquired new stains in colors that probably violated several biological safety protocols. His hair was doing something that defied both gravity and good taste, and he was fairly certain he'd somehow gotten coolant in his left boot again. "Why do you remain here?" Naomi asked. The question caught him off guard. He'd been expecting thank you or perhaps a formal dismissal, not whatever this was. This genuine curiosity that made her seem less like royalty and more like someone trying to understand a puzzle. Here, like the outpost, or here, like existentially in this corner of space doing this particular job? Jack stalled, buying time to figure out if there was a good answer. Because the rent's cheap and the commute is terrible everywhere else? You have skills that would be valued in any major port. You could work for a corporation, a government, even a private fleet. Yet you choose isolation. Jack set down his toolkit and leaned against a support beam, partly because his legs were tired, and partly because it gave him something to do with his hands. The truth was complicated, wrapped up in decisions he'd made years ago, and momentum that had carried him forward until forward was the only direction he knew. I guess I'm afraid I'd be bad at anywhere else, he said finally. Here, I'm the guy who fixes things. People need me, even if they don't always like me. Out there in the big ports and the corporate facilities, I'd just be another mechanic. Replaceable. And maybe I'd fail at it. And then what? At least here, my failures are my own. Naomi was quiet, her dark eyes studying him with that same unsettling focus she'd had all night. Jack wondered what she saw. Probably a human covered in grease making excuses for a small life. He'd wondered the same thing himself often enough. Failure is not remaining in one place, Naomi said slowly. Failure is allowing fear to make your decisions. That's easy to say when you're a princess with a ship that can cross the galaxy. Some of us have more limited options. You think my options are unlimited? Something sharp entered her voice. Not quite anger, but close. I am third daughter. Third. Do you understand what that means? I am the backup to the backup. The one who exists in case tragedy strikes twice. My eldest sister will inherit the throne. My second sister commands the fleet. I am given ceremonial duties and suitable marriages and told to be grateful for the privilege of irrelevance. Jack blinked. He'd somehow never considered that being royalty might come with its own cage, just one with better decorations. Okay, yeah, that sounds terrible, he admitted. But you still strategically relocated. That's something. That's choosing. And you could choose differently. Leave this place. Find somewhere that challenges you, that makes you more than adequate. Naomi stepped closer, close enough that Jack had to tilt his head back slightly to maintain eye contact. You are capable of more than you allow yourself to be. You got all that from watching me fix your ship? I got all that from watching you explain quantum mechanics using metaphors about chairs and then successfully repair systems you had never encountered before. You pretend to be simple, but you are not. You are afraid. Jack wanted to argue, wanted to deflect with another joke, but exhaustion had stripped away his usual defenses. She was right, and they both knew it. And standing in the blue light of an alien quantum drive at dawn seemed like the wrong time to lie. Yeah, he said quietly. Yeah, I'm afraid. Terrified, actually. Has been working great for me so far. Naomi's expression softened, just slightly, and she reached out to touch his shoulder. A brief contact that sent a jolt through him that had nothing to do with static electricity and everything to do with the fact that a princess was touching him like he mattered. Fear is acceptable, she said. Surrender to fear is not. The ship's main hatch stood open, revealing the pale morning sky beyond. Naomi's crew had already begun pre-flight checks, moving through the vessel with practiced efficiency. Jack could hear them calling to each other in their musical language, the words echoing through corridors he'd spent the night learning to navigate. The stocky second-in-command. Jack had learned his name was Torvin, though he still looked like he was contemplating creative uses for that soup spoon. Supervised from the bridge, occasionally glancing down at Jack with barely concealed suspicion. Jack stood near the engineering bay, toolkit at his feet, watching the organized chaos of departure preparations. He should have left already, should have returned to his workshop in the Talaxian freighter with its flux moth infestation, should have moved on to the next job and the next ship in the quiet, predictable rhythm of his life. Instead, he'd stayed, drawn by something he couldn't quite name and didn't want to examine too closely. Naomi appeared from one of the forward compartments, now wearing different garments. Still that same shimmer state material, but configured for travel. more practical and less ceremonial. She carried a small data tablet that projected holographic star charts around her hands as she walked. Her attention divided between the charts and issuing commands to crew members who materialized, acknowledged, and vanished with remarkable speed. "The quantum drive is performing above expected parameters," she said without looking up from the tablet. "Your repairs have actually improved baseline efficiency by 7%. "That's probably the flux moths," Jack said. "They're excellent at optimizing energy flow." Little known fact about flux moths: they're basically tiny engineers who happen to look like glowing butterflies. You should keep them. "We will not be keeping the moths." "Your loss. They work for free and only occasionally chew through critical wiring." Naomi finally looked up, and something in her expression had shifted, less guarded than before, though still carrying that regal composure like armor. She dismissed the star charts with a gesture and moved closer, her footsteps silent on the deck plating. "I have transferred payment to your account," she said. "Standard repair fees, plus a bonus for the urgency and complexity of the work. You will find it generous." Jack's communication band vibrated against his wrist, the outpost banking system confirming a transaction that made his eyes widen when he glanced at the numbers. Generous was an understatement. This was enough to upgrade his entire workshop, buy new diagnostic equipment, maybe even take an actual vacation to somewhere that had oceans and didn't recycle everything, including the atmosphere. That's... wow. "Okay, thank you." He felt like he should bow or salute or do something formal, but his body had apparently decided that awkward shuffling was the appropriate response. "I mean, you really didn't have to pay this much. The repairs were complicated, but not that complicated. Consider it compensation for the temporal paradox you did not create," Naomi said, and Jack realized with a start that she was joking. Actually joking. Her expression barely changed, but there was something in her eyes, a warmth that hadn't been there before. "Right, yeah. I'm basically charging you for disasters that didn't happen. Smart business model. I should put that on my advertisement. Jack's repairs. We probably won't destroy the timeline." A crew member called something from the bridge, urgent sounding. Torvin responded with what was either acknowledgement or a very polite threat. Jack couldn't tell which. The engines began their startup sequence, a sound that built from a whisper to a hum that Jack could feel in his bones. The ship was waking up, eager to leave, to carry its princess back to wherever princesses went when they weren't strategically relocating. "You should go," Naomi said, but she didn't move, didn't step back to create the distance that would make leaving easier. "Yeah," Jack agreed, also not moving. "Probably don't want to be inside when you fire up the quantum drive. Might end up in an alternate dimension where I made better life choices." "Would that be so terrible?" "Depends on whether alternate dimension me kept the coffee maker. I've grown attached to its screaming." They stood there, the moment stretching between them like something fragile and uncertain. Jack had never been good at goodbyes. They required a kind of grace he'd never mastered. But this felt different, weighted with things unsaid and possibilities that lived only in the space between intention and action. "You could leave this place," Naomi said quietly. "Come with us. My fleet needs skilled engineers, and you have proven yourself capable. You would have resources, challenges, the opportunity to work with technology you have never imagined." Jack's heart did something complicated in his chest, a mix of hope and terror that made it hard to breathe. For a moment, one brief, shining moment, he let himself imagine it, working on ships that sailed between stars, traveling to places that existed only in navigation charts, being part of something larger than the outpost and its 3 landing pads and the bar that served questionable liquor. Then reality crashed back in, familiar and suffocating. "I can't," he said, and the words felt like giving up and holding on at the same time. This is what I know. This is who I am. Some guy who fixes ships on the edge of nowhere. Taking that somewhere else doesn't change the guy, just the location." "You are wrong," Naomi said, with the certainty of someone who had never doubted herself. "Context shapes us as much as we shape it. You limit yourself with geography and fear." "Maybe, probably. But jumping on a royal ship because a princess asked nicely seems like exactly the kind of impulsive decision that ends with me floating in space wondering where it all went wrong. Naomi studied him for a long moment, and Jack wondered what she was thinking, whether she saw potential or just another human too afraid to reach for anything beyond his grasp. Her hand rose, hesitated, then touched his face, fingers cool against his grease-stained cheek, the contact deliberate and gentle. "Then I will not ask you to be impulsive," she said. "I will ask you to be brave. There is a difference." Another call from the bridge, more urgent this time. Torvin appeared at the top of the boarding ramp, his expression dark. He spoke rapidly in their language, and Naomi responded without breaking eye contact with Jack, her tone carrying authority that made Torvin retreat despite his obvious displeasure. "We need to depart," she said. "Now. There are ships approaching, likely sent by my family or his family or both. I do not wish to be here when they arrive." Jack stepped back, creating the distance that would let her go, that would let this moment end the way it was supposed to end. "Then you should go. Run, strategically relocate, whatever keeps you from marrying the beetle enthusiast." "Jack, it's okay. Really, this was the most interesting night I've had in 15 years. Thank you for crashing on my landing pad." Naomi's hand was still on his face, her thumb tracing a line across his cheekbone that left a trail of sensation he'd feel for days afterward. The engines thrummed louder, the ship ready to leap skyward, and Jack could see Torvin at the controls through the open bridge viewport, his hands moving across holographic interfaces with increasing urgency. "I should tell you something," Naomi said, her voice cutting through the engine noise, "about why I chose this outpost specifically." Jack frowned. "You chose it? I thought you crashed here because your drive failed." "The drive failed because I made it fail. I overloaded the spatial harmonics intentionally, calculated the exact trajectory that would bring us down here, to this place, to you." Her eyes held his, unflinching. "I researched every repair facility within 3 sectors. I read your service records, your repair logs, even the incident report about the Valorian trader. I needed someone capable and isolated, someone who wouldn't ask questions or report a princess traveling without proper authorization." Jack's mind reeled, replaying the night with this new context. The crash that had seemed catastrophic suddenly revealed itself as controlled chaos, every damaged system calibrated to appear worse than it was while remaining fixable. She'd crashed a royal vessel on purpose, risked her crew, all to reach a backwater outpost that most people forgot existed. "You're insane," he said, though there was admiration in it. "You could have killed everyone on board." The probability of critical failure was only 17%. Acceptable odds. She almost smiled. "And I am third daughter of the celestial house. Calculated risks are the only power I have." The ship lurched slightly, compensating for something. Torvin shouted from the bridge, pointing at a display that showed multiple contacts entering the system, their trajectories converging on the outpost with mathematical precision. The family fleet had arrived, and they were not happy. "You need to leave right now," Jack said, stepping back fully, breaking contact. "I mean it, Naomi. Go." "Not yet." She moved with him, maintaining the distance between them at exactly arm's length, as if they were caught in some gravitational dance. "You asked why I remain irrelevant, why I do not fight for a place beyond third daughter. The truth is that I have been fighting my entire life, against expectations, against tradition, against a future written before I could speak. I fight by choosing when to surrender and when to run, by finding power in the spaces between rules." "That's great, really inspiring, but those ships are going to be here in about 5 minutes, and I don't think they're coming to admire the sunset." 4 minutes and 17 seconds, Naomi corrected, "and they will not fire on us. Too much political fallout. But they will try to board, to escort me home, to finish what was started, unless I give them reason to hesitate." Jack had no idea what that meant, but he also had no time to ask because Naomi was suddenly very close, close enough that he could count the subtle variations in her blue skin, see the way her long ears swept back when she was determined, smell that ozone and flower scent that made him think of places he'd never been. "I am not asking you to join my crew," she said. "I am not asking you to leave your home or abandon who you are. I am asking you to remember that fear is acceptable, but surrender to fear is not. Can you do that? I, what? Yes, I think so. Jack's brain had stopped processing complex thoughts, overloaded by proximity and adrenaline, and the dawning realization that something significant was about to happen. Naomi cupped his face in both hands, her fingers cool and certain. Good, because I need you to trust me for approximately 30 seconds. Then she kissed him. Jack had kissed exactly 3 people in his life, twice awkwardly in his youth, and once very regrettably after too much of the bar's questionable liquor. So he had limited reference points. But this was different. This was deliberate and soft, and tasted like stardust and possibility, like every choice he'd never made, and every road he'd never taken. Her lips moved against his with the same focus she'd brought to watching him work, as if this moment deserved her complete attention. When she pulled back, Jack's hands had somehow found her waist, his fingers gripping that shimmer state fabric like it was the only thing keeping him anchored to reality. His heart hammered against his ribs, and somewhere in his chest, something that had been locked tight for 15 years cracked open just enough to let in light. I'll come back for you, human, Naomi said, her voice steady as starlight, as certain as quantum mathematics. When I have secured my position, when I have built something beyond third daughter, when I have power enough to choose freely, I will return to this outpost and I will ask you again, and perhaps then you will be ready to be brave. Jack started, but words had abandoned him entirely. Do not answer now. You need time to think, to choose without pressure or urgency. But know this, you are more than adequate, Jack. You are remarkable, and I do not say such things lightly. She stepped back, breaking contact, becoming once again the princess who had emerged from smoke with perfect composure. Torvin, initiate departure sequence. The boarding ramp began to retract. Jack stumbled backward, nearly tripping over his toolkit, his mind still trying to process what had just happened. Naomi stood at the hatch, silhouetted against the ship's interior lighting, looking at him with an expression he couldn't read, but would spend months trying to decipher. Wait, he called out, finding his voice at last. What if you don't come back? What if something happens, or you change your mind, or you decide I'm not worth the trouble? Then you will have spent however long it takes remembering that a princess once crashed her ship to meet you, kissed you in the morning light, and thought you remarkable, Naomi said. That alone should be worth the wait. The hatch sealed with a pneumatic hiss that sounded almost like a promise. The engines flared bright, and the ship lifted, graceful even in ascent, beautiful in ways that made Jack's chest ache. It rose into the pale sky, accelerating smoothly, and within seconds was nothing but a silver streak disappearing into the vast black above. Jack stood alone on the landing pad, in the crater the ship had made, surrounded by fire foam and scorch marks, and the quiet morning air of an outpost at the edge of nowhere. His lips still tingled. His hands still remembered the feel of her waist. His heart still raced with possibilities that terrified and thrilled him in equal measure. Above, 3 larger ships broke atmosphere, the family fleet arriving too late. They hovered for a moment, scanning, then followed Naomi's trajectory into the void, leaving only contrails and silence. Jack bent down, picked up his toolkit, and started walking back to his workshop. The Talaxian freighter still needed its flux moss relocated. Martinez would want to hear about the crash. Chen would complain about the damaged landing pad. Steve, the maintenance bot, would definitely have opinions about the scorch marks. Everything was exactly as it had been before a princess fell from the sky. Except Jack caught himself smiling, actually smiling, as he pushed open the workshop door. His reflection in the metal showed someone different, still covered in grease, still wearing boots held together by faith and adhesive tape, but somehow standing straighter, looking ahead instead of down. Maybe she would come back. Maybe she wouldn't. Maybe he'd spend years waiting for a promise that lived only in that single kiss. But for the first time in 15 years, Jack felt something he'd thought he'd lost. Hope, fragile and fierce, taking root in the spaces between fear and surrender. He set down his toolkit, looked at his coffee maker, and laughed when it started screaming. Yeah, he told it, told the workshop, told the universe and the empty sky. I hear you. The end. Today we heard Jack's story, He stands in his workshop at the edge of the galaxy, holding a promise shrouded in starlight and a kiss that tastes of impossible futures. What about you? If you were Jack, would you wait? Would you cling to the hope that a princess would return? Or would you see it as just a beautiful dream of that extraordinary night? And if you were Naomi, the third girl, forever trapped between duty and desire, would you risk everything in return for a mechanic who could mend your ship and perhaps, just perhaps, something broken inside you? If this story resonated with you, hope, longing, the pain of unattainable possibilities, then do me a favor. Click the subscribe button for Sci-Fi Pulse. Comment below on whether you believe Naomi will keep her promise or what you would do if you were in Jack's oil-stained boots. And if you believe